Hello and welcome everybody to the latest Temple Bar Trust online talk. I'm Lucy Bullivant and I've curated the Trust's online series of talks since last July. I will be moderating today's session and I'm especially delighted to welcome our speaker, architect Stephanie Edwards, who's the co-founder of Urban Symbiotics. Hi Stephanie, very good to have you with us.
Hello, hi. Thank you for having me. Thanks, Lucy. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. So today I'm going to talk to you about, well, how do we empower the disempowered? How can we foster civic pride-free design? And how can we harness the value of a symbiotic approach where everyone benefits?
Can I just cut in there very, very briefly, because what I'll do is I'll introduce you and give a little bit of bio for anybody who's not so fully aware. And I have to do a quick word firstly, just give a first quick word at the beginning about Temple Bar Trust. So I'll give you the nudge when it's time for your talk, and we're really looking forward to it. So Sir Christopher Wren's Temple Bar building on Paternoster Square, which is the architectural gateway to the city, is home to the Worshipful Company of Chartered Architects, of which I am a liveryman. Yes, indeed. And it's managed by the Trust, and it takes as its aim the promotion of architecture in the square mile to a wide public through a regular programme of talks and tours. And a key focus of our work is supporting greater diversity in the architectural profession, a subject of profound and urgent significance that we are addressing as part of our ongoing talk series. So presenting talks online is clearly an interim measure until we can actually use Temple Bar again as a unique space for meetings, dining and entertainment, hopefully not too far off this year. So do check the Trust's website, templebartrust.org, where you can see our talk videos, including a new film series to date, and future events publicised there, which are free of charge. They just require a reservation in advance. So now I'm going to give you your fanfare, Stephanie. It's lovely to be able to introduce you. Stephanie is an architect and urbanist and the co-founder, as I said, of Urban Symbiotics, which is an insight and research-led multidisciplinary design practice based in London, which focuses on the user experience to innovate architecture, master planning, and the quality of the public realm. Stephanie graduated from the AA in 2010, and she worked at OMA before establishing her practice in 2018 with product designer James Stewart. She's currently a board member for Architecture Lobby, an advisory group member for the UK Built Environment Advisory Group, and she was previously an elected council member of RIBA. She was celebrated as a force for change alongside Baroness Lawrence in Vogue's seminal September 2019 issue, and for building mindful cities by the Financial Times in a profile last September. So Urban Symbiotics have been longlisted by RIBA's McEwen 2021 awards for community endeavours targeting improvements for local communities, specifically for Stephanie's work in her reimagining of the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton, and recognised by the London Festival of Architecture and the Design Museum as a practice creating architecture for a new generation. In 2019, the practice was nominated for an H100 Architecture and Design Award. Urban Symbiotics is leading on a regeneration framework at the moment for Purley and Croydon, for Croydon Council, working on the Gascoigne estate in Barking and Dagenham, and in Nigeria as part of UN Habitat's Global Future Cities programme. The practice has also recently been commissioned by Enfield Council to apply its user-focused approach to design the hardscape and the commercial public realm spaces for Meridian Water, one of the UK's largest regeneration projects. So in her talk, in a minute, Designing for Users and Benefiting All, Stephanie will introduce Urban Symbiotics' focus on the delivery of social value through a variety of project types and scales that facilitate the building of inclusive, equitable, and empowered communities, fostering community ownership and civic pride through responsible social stewardship are really fundamental capacities and agencies that we badly need to build and enable more of today. So this topic aligns closely with our strong motivation at the Trust to investigate issues of identity and meaning in contemporary architecture and to place a valuable focus on practitioners' active engagement of diverse communities, narratives, and languages in London through resilient, equitable cultural drivers of placemaking in the city in the 21st century as it transitions through the COVID crisis into a new era. So as I said, we are really, really looking forward to your talk, Stephanie. And after Stephanie has spoken, we'll have a Q&A session. Actually, she and I will have a little dialogue before that, but then we'll make sure we have plenty of time for the Q&A discussion. So please put your questions to her in the chat box. So thank you, Steph, over to you.
Wow, thank you, Lucy. What an introduction. So I will start. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be talking to you today. I feel like we're like-minded people. So as I was mentioning before, what I'd like to talk to you today is really about, how do we really empower the disempowered, and how can we foster civic pride through design? And how can we really harness this real value of a symbiotic approach where everyone benefits? So I'd like to talk to you today particularly about our approach and about three particular projects that we've actually taken through during the pandemic. So very specific to this context. So hello, as Lucy mentioned, my name is Stephanie Edwards and I'm an architect and I'm an urban designer. And my focus is not necessarily about strategizing, designing and creating spaces, from the top and deciding what is best through best practice and, just theory, but actually about starting with the people, but starting with the users of spaces, with the users of buildings and areas and environments, starting with the people, because this is where I really believe that this is where we can really truly find our inspiration. We can find key insights, and we can also stop making, potential mistakes that can be, stopped from the very first instances. So what if by doing so, this approach also enabled us to really contribute to social value, not just from a social perspective, but from an environmental perspective. Maybe it's about, enhancing behavioural change to a sustainable way of behaving, or also financial value. How do we do so that it actually meant that communities who are disempowered are more empowered? What if actually it led to more community ownership? And what does that actually mean? And what if actually it started to foster civic pride? But I'd also say that just because, what if, for example, we had so many of these social benefits, it doesn't mean that financial benefits aren't a possibility. And what if actually increased financial benefits? What if actually it lent to lower maintenance costs? And then actually innovative design solutions. As designers, maybe this is the way we should really be looking forward. And really just ensuring that it is a real win for everyone when we do design for places and for people. So how? I guess before I jump into how, I'd really like to talk to you about the status quo. So currently, in 2018, 2 years ago, the British Social Attitude Survey, and both in the Civic Voices 2019 online survey, really identified that those who are really actively involved and who oppose new development are predominantly owner-occupiers. They live in villages, they're over the age of 45, and they come from a 2-adult and 2-children household and tend also to be retired. And I'm sure if there's a lot of designers and architects in the room, this is not, shocking statistics at all. It's what we see in town halls. But also when we start to look at, the fact that neighbourhood plans have come into place where It is, for example, a structure that allows the neighbourhood and community to start to really own their spaces and shape their future neighbourhoods. That actually only 5% of those that are completed are in urban areas, highly populated areas, diverse areas. And similarly, only 6.7% of these neighbourhood planning areas are in places that are classified as most deprived. So what does this mean? This means for me that we're missing out on so many people who, where are the gaps? The gaps are larger than those who are actually involved. We're missing those who are under 45, professionals who may be busy. We're missing those who rent. We're missing teenagers and young people. And we're missing so many people that actually use spaces that aren't actually being engaged in how to shape their future. So why now? I feel like these questions are more important than ever. Over the last 12 months, and literally 12 months in coming up this month, whilst we've been going through a global pandemic, so many aspects have come to light. That the idea that we're spending so much time within our homes, understanding that not all of our homes are adequate and the space standards aren't necessarily met to homeschool, to work from home, and also live and have entertainment in a space. There's aspects of loneliness. The idea of an office has changed dramatically as to how we view those office spaces now that we've found other ways of managing that. Community has said to be enhanced. People feel like there's a better sense of community where people are feeling more connected. But then there's also the aspect of, in the first elements of the pandemic, we managed to house almost all of our homeless people for a decades-old problem. And then finally, open space. We've really started to see what's working for and against us in terms of the open space that surrounds us in our neighbourhoods and how that affects our well-being. But just 2 months into the pandemic, a YouGov survey said that only 9% want a complete return to normal. So what does that look like? For me, these questions are really important. As designers, it's really about looking at how we can start to create future places that are appropriate to our new lifestyles and to the lifestyles of the people that will be ultimately using the spaces we design. So as I mentioned before, I start with the people. So I set up Urban Symbiotics with James Stewart. James Stewart, who's a product designer, and myself, I'm an architect and urban designer. And we're really trying to look at a unique approach to architecture and urban design by using a product design perspective. So in terms of the standard approach, as an architect, I was trained in the same way. We really focus on design as the main aspect, and then engagement's almost an add-on with limited insight that starts to feed into this design process. So we're trying to turn it on its head, or just enlarge the first sight, the first aspect. What if unique engagement is just as important as the design? And what if the aspects that really underpin this and made it extremely important is that insight that we gain from engagement, not about telling people what we think is right for them, but actually using the insight from them to understand how we can influence design. How can we find out what are the actual issues that we need to solve, and how can we creatively look at delivering it with them, but also feeding off of their unique fears, aspirations, and also needs. So our idea is, as opposed to just having your standard approach of engagement or consultation relatively early or just before planning, and then engagement again later on down the line, we're very much interested in what does it look like to have continuous engagement, to bring the user in from the beginning right to the end. Some people may be thinking, who has the budget to do this and who will pay for this? There's so many different ways of being able to do that, whether that's just through feedback loops, so that you're able to tell people at certain points how their information has been used or hasn't been used, what solutions have been taken forward and haven't. This is all part of the empowerment that we start to see as we start to bring people into the design of their future places. So our process. So we have this almost 3, or you could also say 8-stage process where we look at unique engagement. Unique engagement is really looking at who are the users of an area. So we look at the demographics. What are their potential barriers to engagement? So For example, what's stopping people under 45? What's stopping younger people from engaging in the process? And how can we come up with a unique engagement methodology to say, we're breaking these barriers down and we're inviting people to participate? We then move on to insight, really gaining that insight, asking the deep questions as to why people would like to see certain aspects in their area, or what are the fears or issues that we may need to overcome in our spaces. And then that can start to lead to this co-creation stage. Not necessarily all the time co-design, it can be co-solving, but we call it co-creation and innovation. It's being very specific about problems and aspirations and developing it together as to the fitting solution. And that's not only with the community, but it's also with the client. It's also with all team members within a project. But also then, by starting to look at this process of co-creation and innovation, we're bringing people along so that they have this sense of ownership. So that by the time you're, let's say, going to put something for planning, you're actually at the stage of validation and celebration. It's a time where people come together. It's a time where people are really happy to see that the future of their area is something where their voice has been embedded, and leading to championing. Actually, instead of opposing, how can we turn this around to getting people to champion what's happening? And then, of course, use and operation. How can this feedback then start to link back and, continue within our projects, other projects in the area? And as we started off in the first instance, it is about empowerment and ownership. From the first aspects of insight at the beginning, all the way to championing, you really start to see this empowerment and ownership start to grow amongst communities. And we start to see that and record that in the way that we do our work. So I'm just going to jump in and talk to you about 3 distinct projects that we've been working on during lockdown. And they're very much in this flexible and open process. But I'd just like to talk to you about, some of the hurdles that we traversed, but some of the solutions that we found in really putting the user first. So Purley Strategic Framework. We were commissioned by Croydon Council this time last year, so just before lockdown. And it's a regeneration framework to look at the development of an area in Croydon, in South London, and to look at how that future regeneration can actually start to benefit its community, its businesses, and the stakeholders in the area. Just to give you a bit of context, it's an area with immense change, a lot of development, and what we were told is a super angry community. So what did we say? We said, let's just start with a continuous engagement approach across all 6 stages. So how we can really start to build in that insight, or really try to understand what the initial issues that people faced were right from the beginning. We weren't sure whether we would have on face-to-face engagement or online, but as it worked out during the pandemic, a lot of it was taken online. So actually, in that instance, we really started to think about how can we make this meaningful? How can we make this engagement? How can we make that work? And how can we really get to grips and get under the skin of an area? So we decided to set up a panel called the Purley panel for the area of Purley. But in order to do so, we really needed to understand who are the people of Purley and what are the, how will Purley start to change? So we looked at, for example, the tenure, like who owned in Purley, who rents in Purley. We looked at the gender split, we looked at the age, and we also, compared it to the population in England. And we were very focused on how can we ensure that we do curate a panel that reflects this. So we curated a panel that represented the real community of Purley, but whilst we did that, it was so important that because we were creating a panel in the midst of this pandemic, that actually, whilst the people should demographically represent the area, they should also have a voice for a larger community. So this became a curated panel based on the demographic constitution of Purley. It became our single point of engagement initially. It also allowed, the sense of cross-demographic appreciation and education. And so we had people on there from the local mosque. We had people there representing food banks, which had increased massively over the last year. We had young mums. We had several youth projects that we spoke to and had them as part of the panel. We had residents associations, but we also had members of the local church and also those within the BID. So, for example, those who are representing businesses. And it was really important that these then became community ambassadors and also started to look at how can we ensure that this framework was not only just a report that stayed on the shelf, but became flexible and actually started to build into a legacy. So meet the Purley panel. It was super interesting to start to work with them as to what their issues were. We had one-to-one calls with each of them first to really work out who were the best people on site. But what was great about this is that we had issues of the community saying they didn't want new buildings, but actually it was just about ensuring that we had the correct infrastructure. And then we had aspects of, what all of them really came to the crux of is that they wanted to ensure that they build community spirit within a regeneration framework. How do you design in community? And so it was a great starting point. And how do you make Purley a place where people want to go? So this is where we started. We also started to give them a voice and a platform, so they have their own Purley panel website. And then actually in terms of reaching out to the wider community, they all put for example, this wider survey on their own respective websites. And within 4 hours, we had over 100 responses in the area. And it just showed the testament to showing that actually if you get the community to start to champion something, how you can use them as trust routes to start to get people to engage more. So what did we do with this insight? We worked with insight to work out what are the areas of pain, where are the areas that need to change, where are the areas of opportunity. So we have this insight map where we mapped all of the insight analysis, so we have layers and layers of insight of this. But then this moved on to, for example, where's the antisocial behaviour areas? Where's the car park that no one uses? Where are the areas that people are brought into or are actually barriers to actually use the space? But then we use this insight to inspire the framework and realised that this framework not only needed to be a physical framework that looked at improvements along the high street and greening, but also about culture. How do you programme the space? How do you make it an attractor? And how do you make it this destination that the community so desperately wanted? So these are some of the insights, so I'll just run through them. And these are some of the aspects that have underpinned this vision. So together with the Purley panel, we started to look at the high street as a hub. How can you create an area that is specifically traffic dominated into an area that can be flexible, an area that can be an intimate space, an area that can be safe, an area where you can test sustainability principles, an area where you can have your digital high street. And this started to look at also projects that the community could take on themselves, so reducing financial implications for Croydon Council, looking at where different community groups could come together, and also starting to look at spaces where their aspirations could be fulfilled. But also looking at, what does it mean to have a high street now? Is this a place with active places that people could work from home in an area where they come together locally? But then also looking at, for example, the thoroughfare that runs through Purley as a showcase. They wanted this area almost to be a shop front as to advertise what's happening in Purley, a place that unified and celebrated its heritage, but also started to look at what it meant to have an experience, what it meant to walk in this area, but also drive through to know that you'd like to stop again. Ensuring that we had vehicular access throughout the entire time, but having spaces where people could sit out, that you could start to green areas. There's so many different areas of where we could really embed this community voice within these specific areas. Or whether it's the station's a catalyst. We're told that no one wants to cycle in Purley, but actually it was just because it was quite hilly. So we spoke about, can the station be a place where you change modes of transport through electric bikes? There was issues of lack of parking for new developments. We turned this into, maybe this is a spot where you ensure that you have electric or shared car use within this area, or actually turning the station into a hub where it can be a place of wayfinding, bringing people into the main high street and the main areas of destination that currently are going unused and are, dilapidating. And then abandoned spaces and inspiration. So we looked at Purley Sundays, but we also looked at Purley lanes and yards, how we can use underused spaces in a way that starts to inspire uses for, young people to start to do community projects and artwork, starting to enhance these derelict and unsafe spaces into key connections into this almost discovery of Purley. And then finally, the parks as a community centre. What does it mean now where we're all outside and trying to work out how we can use our parks in the best way? Is it not only a play space, but a place for adults to congregate, for young people to come together, to exercise? As we all know, parks are more important than ever, but how can we also maintain this biodiversity, but also start to look at the community coming together to own these aspects? So we're looking at tree planting and actually looking at a festival that starts this initial Purley Sundays with different events throughout the entire area of Purley, specifically on Sundays, knowing that there's free car parking and a very active community that wants to start bringing people to the area. So moving on to the Gascoigne estate, we're working with Be First to look at this estate renewal. It's an area of change. And so initially, this also started pretty early on in lockdown. And if we look at the initial response, there was a lot of low response and representation for some of the sites that were coming forward of this, new, renewed estate. Only 3 people responded in the entire area. So Be First and worked with us to start to increase that engagement. So we looked at targeted telephone engagement, we looked at community volunteers, we looked at vulnerable support groups, but also looking at virtual engagement, social media, online live streaming, as we're all doing now, but very much looking at tapping into the fact that we're now connecting in very different ways. And so we sent out an array of emails. We worked with BFES had already started with schools, competitions, so we tapped into the parents of those. But actually we started to realise that some of the barriers to access was, a low uptake of, historically being engaged in the future of change, but also time, and also we decided to look at whether money was a barrier. So we looked at incentives too, to incentivise their participation in workshops. And so this is where we started to create like a really interesting group. So we managed to do several workshops over the summer. Then we looked at, for example, a Gascoigne residents forum, so that whilst this change is happening over the next 10 years or so, we started to look at a forum that can actually start to be representative of this new group of people moving in, but also those existing people on the estate. So we looked at people of different religions, different ethnicities, and a good gender split that all referred and reflected what was happening on the Gascoigne estate. So these are just some of the members on the Gascoigne Residents Forum, and it's a great team, and we worked with them to capacity build so that they could actually be really meaningfully involved in how they could start to shape their space through placemaking. But we also started to understand what they really needed and what their aspirations were. So some of the aspects that came from this was super interesting. During lockdown, we worked out that, whilst a lot of the time we focus on parks for play space, there was no spaces for adults. There's no spaces to work in a quiet area. They needed to reduce the noise of children's areas, which kind of goes against the whole, doorstep play. What does that mean for us as designers in this post-pandemic world? Are we designing in the right way? And how to create this sense of community, but also reduce crime and have opportunities to residents to work on the development. So we did a lot of interactions through all capacity building online, through polls, through breakout rooms, big discussions, big online concept boards and chat rooms to really start to delve deep into what is needed and how they could actually make a change. We spoke about what does it mean for areas for adults to congregate? How do you look at outside spaces for people to start to work? But then also looking at very direct areas, working with HTA to see how some of their park design could start to work with developing some of the influences, the aspects of aspiration and fears, and really bringing this idea of what does identity mean for a future identity of people? How can that be embedded in a place? How can it be flexible enough for people to make a change? And how can you start to look at different aspects of art and pop-ups in spaces? So again, because we had this continuous sense of insight, we continued this feedback, areas for people to come together, areas for adults to congregate, and spaces for play and areas for sport. And so BFAS took this forward to work with Fabric and ourselves to look at co-design. What do these places all mean? So now we've worked on the co-design of a pocket park in Gascoigne so that they can actually start to curate, co-create, and potentially co-build areas of new play spaces, areas for adults, for growing, for learning, and spaces for respite. And it's just more important than ever. So going from 12 months ago to 3 participants and 12 months later to now a future space that they have all been actively designing with has been incredible. We've seen them empowered by sending us reference materials, being super engaged, talking about what they've learned, and just really starting to enjoy the space that they had. But also bringing new projects forward, such as the identity and the wayfinding for the area. But then as we look at, this is a project that James worked on in terms of branding, and we just looked at, the fact that as designers, we're very focused on, fulfilling a brief, but actually when we start to talk to the community and get them involved, we then start to create environments that can be active, environments that can be truly used during the day and the night in a way that is quite interesting and innovative and different. And just one aspect of, the sense of empowerment. So one of the quotes we had from one of the first workshops was that all they had was pawnbrokers and gambling shops and chicken and chip and pound shops, and that they identified that they are worth more than this. So they really just, the actual fact that we took the time to listen to them is important in itself. So it's not just about the final aspect, but about the process. Finally, looking at the Black Cultural Archives, we were engaged to work with them just before the pandemic, and so our remit completely changed. But before that, we managed to speak to those taking over through bookshops and events in the Black Cultural Archives. We spoke to their staff. We did a coffee for your thoughts. We really wanted to work out, as this institution of an archive for Black history in the UK, what's working, what isn't. And we worked out there are so many aspects that, we spoke to also the Black community outside. You have Christina Ohuga who's from the sporting world. We spoke to so many people as to what does a place for Black history in the UK work, what works, what doesn't work, what are people expecting? And we started to look at maybe this is an institution from that needs to be a lot more outward facing, a building and a space that actually needs to actively be able to engage, a space that needs to be able to invite people to use it. At the moment, it's a bit of an austere listed building where people don't necessarily feel encouraged to interact, to engage, to understand what's happening. So we're starting to work with them as to how do you start to almost bring down the gates, open up your doors, and really start to encourage activity into these spaces where you are in Brixton and you are next to Windrush Square, and how it all starts to tie in with each other. So these are just aspects of, what if you can use it for film screening, if you can start to cover, if you can activate it, if you can start to bring people from Windrush Square into the area, how can the building sing more? And so during COVID, we worked with them actually to start testing these ideas. We moved their reception area out into their forecourt. We started a community, almost like Corona safe garden, where people could activate and learn in a space that started to blend in with its natural environment. And then also co-creating, what did the space look like? What plants should be used? How should this come together in the summer where people were really feeling vilified in terms of being under attack with COVID, but not having necessarily spaces to use? So we're now looking at how we can start to look at the wider areas. We're looking at the internal spaces, we're looking at the programme, we're looking at the user experience, how it can tie into its context, and also using prototyping. So we're looking at changing wayfinding, that wayfinding can start to move through different senses of movement. We're looking at a garden that can start to prototype different uses, that can be movable, that is flexible. And we're also now doing that with its space and looking at pop-ups. So also it's about, it's not necessarily the final aspect, but how can you bring the user involved into starting to test some of the ideas that we have and test what works and really start to help co-create great solutions with them. So yes, those are the three projects that I just wanted to look at, how just even the process of engagement, the process of design, and how we can start to bring innovation early, but with also the user, but also start to build that empowerment ownership. So the final product isn't necessarily, just one bright and shiny image, but it's an outcome that is championed, an outcome that is used by the community, a place that really starts to stoke civic pride and really foster that really real sense of enhanced empowerment and pride. Thank you. Oh, I can't hear you, Lucy.
Right. I'm back.
Yeah, that's great.
That was brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephanie. The quality of curiosity, the value of curiosity has untold value. That was really the business. I think you really leave no stone unturned in your quest for better places. It's like the very best urbanists who came before you. You really start with the people. I think you demonstrate so clearly how engagement can be different, genuinely holistic and inclusive, continuous and integral to the design process through really thoughtful, innovative, observation-based community activation and co-creation strategies. So drawing really deeply on the wisdom of lived experience, making it far more relational. And I really love the panels and the forums that you describe. These are citizen assemblies. They're a really vital resource. If building back better is going to mean anything at this very important point. So breaking with the status quo, business as usual, to create a win for everyone: local social value, empowered communities, civic pride, health and well-being supported, and financial benefits too. And as you say, that you cited that statistic, only 9% want a complete return to normal. So it's easy to do the maths. That means, doesn't it, that 91% want something fundamentally different. And it all hinges on enabling and investing in the quality of the community engagement and connections made and sustained. So if anyone would like to put a question to Stephanie, please put it in the chat. And let me just have a look and see. We do have already, we've got one or two questions coming in. So I've got a couple of questions I'd like to kick off with, Stephanie. We can have a little bit of a dialogue first. And they're really about the power and advantages of best practice community enabling and truly diverse multidisciplinary teams to basically take up the cudgels and advance in these enlightened ways. So firstly, this week actually, my sense of time is getting expanded in these times. The Centre for London's new public planning manifesto launched this week. It calls upon the mayor to publish a draft mayoral statement of community involvement, committed to better involving local people in local change. And the measures proposed include funding for multidisciplinary training to build the skills of local authority officers, councillors and community champions, as you mentioned, to establish mayoral community advocates to support public involvement at every stage of the process, which again, that's fundamental to the way you work, and an accreditation process for London's local planning authorities and developers to reward very good public community engagement. All great ideas. So at the manifesto launch, Olaide Obo, who's the head of partnerships at Developers First Base, she emphasised the need to ensure genuine enabling process because the quality of the scheme is so much richer. As a consequence, she said, with a greater opportunity to ensure that real issues of health and work inequalities can be tackled through a multi-layered approach. So as you've said, and I've said, we're both in unity on so many things. A community spirit in London knows no bounds. especially after the last year, with so many areas of the city in huge need now of much better public engagement, starting much earlier in the process as well, and done with people, not to them. So what's your view of this initiative? I think you watched the video of the talk for the launch. How can current and future urban projects ensure the ongoing long-term active involvement of diverse communities, including members whose voices are rarely valued? How do you envisage that this can take place?
I mean, I think, firstly, I think the manifesto is fantastic and it couldn't come at a better time. I mean, it could have come earlier, obviously, but I think it's actually a really fitting time to really start to challenge the mayor to take this up. I think for me, the most important aspect of, taking it forward or ensuring that it does happen and occur meaningfully is actually just about really communicating that value, or for people to really understand the value of community engagement. Community engagement can often be seen as very political. It can often be seen, obviously a lot of people see it just as a tick box, but actually worse, a lot of people are fearful. They feel like they're just going to get opposition, and it's all about that angry and loud voice, as opposed to this kind of collaborative voice, or a voice that is fair and does understand constraints if you explain them. And you really start to look at how you can really embed people into that process, but it does enable priorities. And I feel like where we've worked best is with clients that have come on the journey with us, so they can start to see, oh, actually, this is an interesting discussion and we can help to prioritise, and they don't want the earth, and we can actually get a financial benefit and reduce the maintenance. And actually, it really is a win for all. And so for me, it just makes complete sense. But I really do feel like not everyone truly understands that value. So if there is a way of really trying to do that, but if you do have accreditation, as the manifesto suggests, and you do start to reward people from doing that, almost by doing, you start to find out what works. So I just couldn't agree with it more, and I really hope that it starts to change the way that as an industry we view it.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I'm sure Mayor Sadiq Khan will be completely behind it. I mean, he's just launched his campaign to be reappointed in May, and his headline points were jobs, jobs, jobs. But he was also absolutely, he's got to build and lead on the green economy, Green New Deal, deal with rough sleeping, rent controls. He said no. I mean, there was a whole menu of things that he was saying just an hour ago at his launch that he's going to deal with. So hopefully next time he comes on the screen, he'll mention that particular manifesto as well and back the campaign. So my other question is about your view on what are the necessary steps needed to permanently shift procurement of design and community enabling teams for London's diverse neighbourhoods towards a genuinely more diverse makeup, and what are the advantages? I mean, you and I know this, but so if you could spell out what are the advantages of boosting team diversity and breaking down the barriers that have traditionally existed between professionals and residents, despite the great placemaking initiatives that exist and have taken place here and there that already break this mold. I mean, especially now at this major pivotal point where inequalities are even more marked than ever, and London has to, it's got a Herculean effort to recover from the pandemic in holistic and remediatory ways by putting into action really positive ideas to make the city genuinely more livable in the widest sense.
Okay, maybe I'll start with why a diverse team. I think we all know, maybe we don't all know, that diverse teams with people from different backgrounds, with different thoughts, with different approaches, even different disciplines, actually result in more successful outcomes. Like there's been studies that have, occurred over decades saying that, over 75% more productivity. and more successive outcomes where you have more diverse teams, you know, split across gender lines, split across ethnicity lines, but also split across just different ways of thinking. And so actually, especially within, you know, the built environment, within the creative sphere, it's almost doing us an injustice to just be going out to one type of person. And I think what's quite interesting is that we really are starting to see procurement start to bring in, you know, how are you going to address your project through equality, you know, diversity and inclusion. And I think that's a really good step forward. And I think it's just really important that that continues and that it is sustained and that structures are put in place to ensure that we do have that diversity of thought that will continue within projects and that will be valued. Again, it's about value. It's not just about, this is a really nice thing to do because I'm a nice person. It's like, actually, you'll get a better outcome and you'll have different ways of thinking and different thoughts and different solutions. And then in terms of, you know, that relationship between communities and professions, I really do feel as if we really do need to think about how we start to communicate with different people and different communities, knowing that we need to sometimes leave the jargon at home and we need to explain ourselves a bit better. And we shouldn't necessarily just go in with best practice because it is best practice, but explain why it is, but also realise that we can learn just as much from different people as well as, you know, ourselves. We have different lived experiences, which, you know, as you said, becomes more, you know, you have a richer understanding. That means you can have a richer solutions. And so actually it just goes hand in hand. Like, the team should be more diverse in their thinking, you know, the users, because the users are diverse already. It's just about actually talking to them and bringing them in as part of the process. And it really is about, you know, that future of living. If everyone is accommodated for, or more people than less, like, we'll be living in better places, we'll have more vibrant spaces, it'll be, you know, more secure, be less, you know, it won't be perceived as dangerous in some ways. People also won't see the other as an other as much if we start to look at people as just human beings. You know, if we can really almost look at that base point, it's just really important. But at the moment we're not there, so we really do need to encourage the diversity, and we really do need to make sure that that's across all structures and all institutions and procurement and, you know, design solutions too.
You are totally right. We need to carry on making that case, making that very strong, compelling case. And it's very good to know that a number, particularly, you know, a number of local authorities have taken a very important lead in terms of the procurement ethos as well, and some private developers. But I think it's the local authorities in London, as we're focusing on London in this talk, particularly, I hope, who have made steps. So I can see you've got a few questions in the chat. So okay, so from Deep Singh, who has he's very complimentary, fantastic presentation. Wants to know, how do you deal with the conflict of interest between the NIMBYs and the more forward-looking residents in one forum? Purley has quite contrasting income levels, and he's also, apologies if it's deep, might be a man or a woman. Is that deeper? No. Anyway, so second part of the question is, do you envisage a continuation of digital forums post-pandemic, given their success with residents, or would you combine some hybrid with IRL events? So maybe we look at the first one initially.
So I just want to say thank you to Amandeep, because he was also working on some of the
Amandeep. Oh, right. Okay.
On the Be First project, and he's doing such great work in the team at Be First. Again, it's, you know, it's about having the client that can really understand the value, and that's super important. So yeah, just also a bit of a shout out to that. But in terms of NIMBYism, it's really interesting. In Purley, it's true. And what's interesting about our panels, we have everyone on, not everyone on the panel, but we do have those NIMBYs on the panel. But we also do have, you know, younger people that are looking to live in the area, and we also do have young mums, and we have renters. And what's actually really fantastic about this dynamic is that they're able to hear each other's opinions, and really start to understand that they want the same thing. And actually, by identifying what their issues are in the first instance, we can start to look at solving what those issues are. So some of the issues people had were they don't have enough parking. So we spoke about creating development briefs to ensure that, there was like kind of a shared car scheme. They felt as if, for example, there weren't enough setbacks. So we're looking at, okay, how can we start to make sure Purley's a lot more green? But actually, what was really interesting is at the guts of it, the real issue is that people felt like Purley is just being ignored, that it's just turning into a place that is a dormant area, a place that used to be a destination and really beautiful is just being neglected. So actually, it was about the care, it was about not being listened to. And there's so many other aspects that as soon as you start to actually listen to their voice, they're able to talk to you about what their issues are. And then, once they're on board, they're able to start to say, okay, we can now improve. It's almost changing the mindset to, I'm going to complain about everything, and empower them to actually make a change themselves. Okay, you don't like this, but what can you change? Let's work on this together. We're doing a project just putting in trees, and actually this is something that can bring people together, and it seems small, but it's actually a step in the right direction where people are constantly telling people, nothing's going to change. So as soon as you start making these small changes, it makes a difference. And then I think in terms of would we continue with the digital forums, I would say it's really interesting because I feel like this is probably an answer to the future of the way we're going to live. It's probably going to be a bit of both. We've had really great success online, bringing people together, but it also, we need to ensure that those who are digitally poor aren't being excluded. So we've done one-to-one phone calls with, some of the older residents or residents that don't have that digital capability or even like amenity. So I think it's just really important. We still really need to, we're still really interested in piggybacking on events that people will go to and knowing that people are social beings. So I think it'll be really interesting to see where digital works and where we need to also meet in person. So definitely a hybrid. I think me and Lucy were talking about us being intrinsically social beings. So it would be a shame to miss out on that.
Oh yes, definitely. And as somebody who does place strategy myself, I'm all in favour of that hybridity of approach. I think you've got just the right approach and the knack as well. Also, the knack for when you're encountering people who complain about everything as a knee-jerk reaction, because it's easy to start complaining about everything. I do empathise, but you've got the knack to actually somehow open out the conversation and somehow trigger, a new transition into a bigger conversation. I'm sure it's just about building a sense of trust. So another question is from Nina Burrick, and she wants to know, did you do any capacity building or training for the people and the residents that you worked with, in order that they could actively engage in the ideas and the design process?
Yes, yeah. So with the Gascoigne Residents Forum, the first few workshops, I think there were 4 workshops, were all capacity building. But actually what we found really interesting was how we could turn capacity building into capacity exchange. So what was great is we would have something super punchy and really informative in terms of capacity building on, for example, one of the items was placemaking. And we spoke about placemaking in terms of ingredients and what it means to make a good place, what works, what doesn't. But also what was really great about that is for every capacity building session, we also had an insight and discussion stage. So it's about exchange. So we really wanted to hear from them, so what do you think is a good place? What do you feel like placemaking is to you? So whilst we're capacity building them, they're also capacity building us in terms of understanding the context more, understanding their thoughts, any aspects that we can add to our own best practice. But I thought it was really great because now we're working with the residence forums to work with different architects and different landscape architects, and they're able to engage better, and they're able to have really engaging conversations and meaningful conversations. But we're also from that school of thought that architects and designers also need to be really clear in the way they describe things. People shouldn't always have to have capacity to participate. We should be able to talk to people as, and explain our complex, maybe projects in a way that is accessible. So yeah, a bit of both.
I totally agree. Ian Morris says, great talk. And his question, how can the process engage with pseudo-public spaces? I'm thinking of things like the glut of viewing galleries on the top of tall buildings and the square at Temple Bar. Pseudo-public space. Yeah, I suppose, during pandemic, we've obviously been subject to masses of restrictions, but I really I do understand what he's getting at.
I think it's super important because pseudo public spaces are like becoming our public spaces more and more. These are the spaces we use. You could say that, the entire area of King's Cross is a pseudo public space because it's not actually public, but it is a place that people are using, for example, as their back gardens in the summer for fountains. And actually, I think it's more important than ever, even more important in these pseudo spaces, to really ensure that we find out ways that these places can be more engaging and can be more inviting, and that we don't even accidentally put design cues in that really start to restrict uses, even though some may say that that may be the intention. But actually, if you want a vibrant place, it's really about, taking those opportunities and those priorities. So yeah, I think it's just even more important in those spaces, and actually a really exciting challenge.
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree. So Clovis Lowe would like to know, how do you consider the retention of cultural diversity, or how would you consider that could be done, the very valuable retention of cultural diversity after or post the regeneration of what are historically diverse communities in neighbourhoods with historically diverse communities?
So I think in terms of cultural diversity is a really interesting question, because there's so many different ways that you can look at that. So, for example, cultural diversity, I think it's really important that people and histories never get lost, regardless of where it changes. So, for example, again, looking at the Gascoigne estate, like, it's really, they're looking at how can, within their wayfinding, within their public space, how can it start to reflect history? But when you speak to them, it's not necessarily just about, history from decades ago or centuries ago. It's actually current history. It's history that's occurring now, recent history about the different cultures that live in the area over 60. It's about the different languages that are spoken. How can that be celebrated in the spaces, in the programme? And then in somewhere like the Black Cultural Archives, it's more important than ever to make sure that that cultural diversity is there and is celebrated, and something that can, we'll always say, as soon as you enter that institution, you should never leave the same. You should always feel as if you have learned, that that you're able to really understand different cultures and that you're able to engage. But then in terms of cultural diversity of maintaining people's presence, that's also looking at the structure of how we start to ensure that, certain groups aren't excluded from spaces. Because if you're going to invite them to design the future of an area that's no longer their area, that's also something we really need to be talking about, ensuring there is that sense of maintenance and looking at different tenures and diversity of housing options and affordability. But even so, I feel as if we should always ensure that that cultural diversity is reflected in some sense. And it's really important. And actually, it's where you really start to enjoy spaces. I'm sure when we all think about what's my favourite space, it isn't necessarily about how it looks, it's how it feels, what it smells like. I'm talking to Rosanna from Place Labs, and we're always talking about how carnival could be a really great way of engaging with people. And, what does that mean in terms of activity and vibrancy? Yeah.
Fantastic. So I can see we've come to the end of the questions, and we've actually also, we're almost out of time now. So we've covered absolutely a huge amount of ground. It's so valuable and fantastic insights. Stephanie, thank you so much for such an inspiring, groundbreaking talk, fascinating dialogue. I think the thing is that, I mean, I really admire you. Your work is born of very deep reflection, and you don't seem to have, I mean, nothing is missed out. You've thought about everything. I also really love the fact that you have such a holistic approach, that you consider social soft programming very much within the same frame as the need for physical hard spaces and physical buildings and amenities. But the two for you are very much, you can hear from listening to you how interdependent they can be in a very, very imaginative and thoughtful way, which is not a skill that all architects possess to the same degree. You know, obviously the best ones really have that knack, and it is probably a capacity that can actually be built as well. I'm sure it just requires the right kind of attention. So I think you know, it's a very crystal clear message. It's resounding, and all these ideas from co-creation to capacity building and so much more really what London and other cities and towns need much more of, this kind of lateral thinking, lateral strategic approach. So I really look forward to observing and following how your valuable work advances. So thanks a lot to you, and thank you so much, very much to our audience. Please stay safe, and we look forward to welcoming you back at future talks again in the near future. On the 25th of March, let me plug the fact that we've got leading historian Margaretta Lincoln talking about her brand new book, London and the London and the 17th Century, the making of the world's greatest city. 17th century, for those of you who with a memory of, your history lessons, the most turbulent period in the city's history, even more turbulent than the last year, I guess, one of rapid transition as well. And Margaretta is going to explore the social structures and coping mechanisms that help mitigate the impact of disaster at that point. Maybe there's something that we can glean from that will help us with today's challenges. Anyway, and then tomorrow night at 6:30, that's, what is that, the 5th of March, we screen Chris Williamson's film about the role railways have made in shaping the City of London. So details of Margaretta's talk will be on the website very shortly, but the other film is, obviously, you can sign up by going to the website. Thank you very much, Stephanie, again, and thank you, everybody. See you all again